Professor Lauren Ristvet, the Robert Dyson Chair. She's an assistant professor of anthropology, obviously here at Penn. She researches complex societies in the ancient Near East, and she has a book coming out next spring, you should all look for. Ritual, Religion, and the Origins of Complex Societies in the Ancient Near East, published by Cambridge University Press. And she has worked on research excavations in Syria, Azerbaijan, and Iraq. And today, her talk, opening the colloquium theme Desires, is Colonial Desires, Imperial Negotiation in the Iron Age Caucasus. So thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Diego. The Caucasus occupies an ambivalent place in both modern and ancient geographies, in cultural imaginaries, and in contemporary geopolitics. Aeschylus famously described it as the remotest region of the earth, the prison where Prometheus was shackled for rebelling against an autocratic Zeus and stealing fire, and hence the arts of civilization, from the gods to give to humankind. As part of his punishment, each day an eagle, one of Zeus's symbols, tore out his liver, the seat of emotion and desire. As David Brond has shown, the mythology of Prometheus was critical to how the Caucasus was perceived within the wider classical world. But Prometheus was only the first prisoner of the Caucasus. Beginning in the early 19th century, alongside Russian intervention into this area, poets, novelists, and composers, including Lermontov, Pushkin, and Tolstoy, transformed this theme into a commentary on, and sometimes indictment, of the Russian Empire, a trope that continued into the Soviet and post-Soviet period, as you can see from this film clip from an extremely popular Soviet comedy, which strangely enough has been transformed into a restaurant in Moscow, a restaurant that I would love to go to. In any case, the prisoner became a Russian soldier who offered the gifts of empire, but was placed in peril by the despotism of his superiors and society, and who was saved through the love of a Circassian girl. I've begun with this story for three reasons. First, the position of the Caucasus at the edge of the Near Eastern and then classical world has been critical to Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet archaeology, which have linked imperial and nationalist narratives to Near Eastern, Greek, and Roman ancestors here, a practice I'll explore in the first section of this paper. Second, these stories exemplify the role of desire, in economic, cultural, and sexual terms, as the force behind economic exchange and gift-giving, cultural imperialism, and the acquisition of territory. And finally, this story highlights an unease, an ambivalence at the heart of empire. Today, I want to explore each of these implications as a way to think through the intersection of archaeology and imperialism, drawing upon the work of the joint Azerbaijani-American Nakhchivan Archaeological Project. And we'll move beyond Russian slapstick for a minute. So, this is a project that I direct along with my colleagues Veli Bakhshaliev and Safar Ashrov of the Azerbaijani National Academy of Sciences. I want to consider how moving beyond a model of acculturation to one that acknowledges the key role of imperial ambivalence that emerges through the conflicting desires, interpretations, and actions of multiple local and imperial agencies provides unique insight into the imperial interactions at the fortress site of Ulan, which you see here in the upper left-hand corner. Namely, I'm interested in how people at this site interacted with the empires of Urartu, the Seleucid Empire, and Rome and Parthia. Finally, I'm going to conclude by considering some of the challenges of decolonizing archaeological practice in the contentious space of the post-Soviet South Caucasus. Okay, so on to historiography. The initial forays by imperial scholars in the Caucasus took place within a context of imperialism and empire building, similar to the one that produced the Description de l'Égypte as part of Napoleon's conquest. The first expedition to the Caucasus coincided with the First Russo-Turkish War in 1768. Under the auspices of the Russian Imperial Academy of Sciences, Johann Bodenstedt looks rather dashing in that picture, collected botanical, zoological, linguistic, and archaeological material from the region, while at the same time studying the region's inhabitants and their systems of government. Guldenstedt's two-volume work, Travels in Russia and the Caucasus Mountains, continued to be used in primers for administrative personnel assigned to Caucasus service well into the 19th century. More and more imperial missions followed. The results, too, were immediately integrated into imperial practice. As was the case for several European empires, Rome and Greece provided models for Russian imperial expansion and government, although the classical legacy was interpreted and employed differently here. According to the Third Capital theory, first promulgated in the 16th century, upon the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans, Moscow had become the Third Rome, the newest locus for the true faith. Although this idea soon fell into obscurity, in the 1860s, Imperial Russian historians rediscovered and reinterpreted it. Russia as the Third Rome was depicted as the third great historical empire, the heir of Byzantium and Rome in political and cultural terms. In this interpretation, Russia represented a third way, between the despotic East and the decadent West. By uniting Europe and Asia, its empire had the potential to transcend this dualism. As part of this philosophy, Russian officials formulated a doctrine that Bruce Grant describes as the gift of empire, one in which imperial officials explicitly identified themselves as the latter-day descendants of Prometheus. This is clearly related to other imperial civilizing missions, but with a different understanding of the nature of progress, race, and civilization. This colonial context shaped the infrastructure of archaeology and its choice of subject. A number of archaeological institutions were founded as part of the empire's cultural mission after the pacification of the North Caucasus in the 1860s. These are basically all in Tbilisi, which was the Russian capital of the region. These include the Caucasus Museum, founded in 1867, which you see here, as well as a Caucasian division of the Imperial Archaeological Commission in 1871. The identification with Rome helps to explain why Russian archaeologists in the late 19th and early 20th century devoted nearly as much attention to classical ruins on the Black Sea and in the Caucasus as they did to the remains of Kievan Rus and Russian prehistoric sites. In the Caucasus, Russian archaeologists also worked with Orientalists to investigate the remains of Urartu in the area around Lake Van, now part of Turkey, seeking to establish a claim to the origins of civilization that paralleled the activities of the British excavations of Layard at Nineveh or the work of de Morgan's French team at Susa. The activities of Count Alexei Uvarov illustrate these disparate tendencies nicely. Uvarov was the premier sponsor of archaeology in the late 19th century in Russia. Indeed, he conducted the first scientific excavations in the entire region. In 1880, the Imperial Archaeological Commission dispatched Uvarov to Armenia, where he opened up soundings at Armavir, one of the first Urartian sites ever excavated. In 1881, he arranged for the All-Russian Archaeological Congress to meet in Tbilisi. Uvarov had great plans for the celebration of archaeology in this newly developed territory of the Russian Empire. He even proposed transferring the celebrated Hellenistic ruins of Garni, which you see on the bottom right, to the provincial capital, column by column, perhaps as one way to co-opt the classical past for the imperial present. But the archaeological narratives that imperial archaeologists like Uvarov produced in the 19th century were distinct from those being composed by English, French, American, and German archaeologists. Unlike in these countries, archaeological evidence in the early Russian Empire was rarely used as a justification for claims of racial or cultural superiority. Rather than Slavophilia or a narrative of genealogical purity, several studies in the 1880s emphasized the integration of Russian and Asiatic cultures, connecting Siberian, Mongolian, and Russian folk traditions, or emphasizing the contribution that medieval Armenia and Georgia made to Christianity. Despite their celebration of this plurality, archaeologists from the 1880s to the 1910s were preoccupied with defining precisely where cultural borders lay. This has remained a significant tendency in archaeological scholarship during much of the Soviet and post-Soviet period, where this interest in mapping archaeological cultures was aligned first with Soviet ethnicity policy and later with nation building. both of which strengthened dominant national groups while suppressing smaller ethnicities. The legacies of this in the contemporary South Caucasus, which has been riven by conflict since the 1980s, are profound. So to sum up, the relationship between empire, archaeology, and the construction of the past from the 19th and 20th century is complex. It's not identical to the relationship seen in Western scholarship. Indeed, it can form an illuminating counterpoint to studies of the colonial context of archaeology as they emerge from Trigger, Dietler, and Van Dobelen's work, for example. Nonetheless, certain themes are pertinent to this study and to the interpretation of empire. Most importantly is a tendency towards essentialism and a focus on ethnogenesis. Ancient empires, including Rome, Urartu, Greater Armenia, and Caucasian Albania, have been seen as uncomplicated ancestors to later polities, including Imperial Russia and Armenia and Azerbaijan. This simplistic identification contrasts with the ethnic and linguistic diversity of the present, which you get some sense of here. The multi-ethnic and hybrid nature of ancient empires remains underexplored. An empire is often understood as an ahistorical category, today's idealized reality projected backwards. So, of course, as polities consisting of previously independent units subordinated to a dominant center, empires are by definition multi-ethnic. Moreover, imperial practices and their effects on provinces are extraordinarily diverse and must be analyzed on a case-by-case basis before a useful comparison can be made. Imperial interaction relies upon translation, rendering the goals, needs, and desires of those at the center and those at the periphery in an idiom that can be understood by both. This idiom is as much of a cultural construct as it is a linguistic one, and elements of it are always unpredictable. In this sense, hybridity designates a process of cultural production, a space of iteration where new meanings are enunciated that to some extent reflect and reveal power dynamics. Although iteration and hybridity are generally understood in a purely linguistic sense as structuring colonial discourse within history and literary criticism, I'd like to consider how this process might work if we adopt Charles Sanders Peirce's tripartite understanding of the semiotic, which explicitly includes the material world. I'll follow Bob Purcell and Joanne Barron, whose work on semiotic archaeology has emphasized that objects do not mean in the same way that words do, but that they can still signify. The meaning and social effects of physical objects are established discursively through previous semantic acts in particular contexts. In a colonial situation, this means paying attention to the multiple contexts of each object. Understanding how different things, and by this I mean everything from food to technology to architecture, following up on a discussion that we've had in the class I'm teaching this year, work together, how they shaped each other. Paying careful attention to the material dimensions of imperialism allows us to see how, to quote Michael Dietler, material objects have been simultaneously an important tool of colonial strategies of engagement and control, a catalyst of desire, and a vector of myriad unintended forms of entanglement and cultural transformation. It should thus be possible to interrogate some of the processes of empire through material culture. What goods or practices did societies in Nakhchivan choose to consume or alternatively to ignore, and why? What other factors, including violence and persistent asymmetries of power, affected these engagements with empire? I'm going to consider three different periods: the Middle Iron Age from circa 800 to 600 BC, the Late Iron Age from circa 350 to 250 BC, and the last century or so BC. These case studies highlight three different relationships: what I've termed confronting empire, appropriating empire, and negotiating empire. And sorry, none of these are starting automatically. Okay. So situated on the 130-meter high Kara Tepe in the Shoror Plain, a model of which you see before you, Along the Law formed the administrative quarter of one of the largest cities in the first millennium BC in the South Caucasus. The fortification walls of Along Law, which nicely just popped up, enclosed an area of 12 hectares, a palace and a temple district that towered over the rest of the city. The rest of the city was another walled enclosure that we've been exploring for the past 2 seasons, and that our work will focus on for the next, we hope, 4 or 5 years. And it encloses an area of nearly 5 square kilometers, so 487 hectares, which actually makes it enormous, totally enormous by any sort of Near Eastern standards. Alangala overlooks the largest irrigable plain in Nakhchivan. You can see part of this here, and one of the largest along the Araxes, an important river in the Caucasus. Additionally, this hill is located at the south end of a pass through the Darylyaz Mountains into Armenia, which you can also see nicely there. We've documented a complex Iron Age landscape in the Shur Plains, dominated by Alangala, that includes other fortresses, extensive cemeteries, and the city's fortification walls. Analysis of historical sources and archaeological material collected from these sites suggests that the fortress at Alangala was the dominant center in this plain for much of the Iron Age. Since 2006, the project has conducted 4 seasons of extensive and intensive survey within the plains in order to analyze the microgeographies of imperialism at sites of different sizes and types, while 4 seasons of excavation and survey on the site of Alangala have sampled the citadel, fortifications, and private houses in 2 different sectors of the administrative area. Future seasons will focus on examining domestic life in the city outside. So Alangala was founded sometime in the early Iron Age, between 1200 and 800 BC. Radiocarbon dates indicate, however, that the palace and monumental fortifications at the site were probably constructed in the early 8th century BC, at the same time that the Urartian Empire, Assyria's main rival, expanded from its core in eastern Anatolia to include much of Armenia and northwest Iran. Nakhchivan borders both of these regions, and although there is no epigraphic evidence for the foundation of Urartian fortresses here, it was clearly in an area that was peripheral to this imperial center. Indeed, there's a traditional Urartian fortress located just about 20 kilometers southwest of Alangala, across the Araxes in northwest Iran. In the larger context of the Caucasus, the Urartian objects that Alangala chose to consume, and perhaps more importantly to ignore, are unusual and clue us into the complicated relationship that Alangala probably had with Urartu, a relationship where it strove to maintain some degree of autonomy despite the changing political and economic landscape. Now, Urartu had a clear material imprint, what the archaeologist Paul Zemansky calls the Urartian state assemblage. This is a combination of architectural characteristics, pottery, inscriptions, and luxury goods like metalwork and ivory. The uniformity of the fortresses, which are best understood as imperial centers that were founded ex novo and did not survive the empire's fall, was one way Urartu created and maintained political unity under a ruling ethos in this fragmented space. But Alangala does not conform to the classical pattern of Urartian fortresses. The contemporaneity of the site with the empire and the importance of conformity elsewhere encourages us to interpret this as a conscious act of refusal. Far from being founded ex novo, the 8th century remains lie atop earlier material. Certain characteristic Urartian features were conspicuously absent from the architecture, such as ashlar masonry. You can see Urartian architecture on the bottom, and Alangala's at the top. Moreover, the fortification walls, which you see, these are sort of Urartian fortification walls, which are extremely regular and nicely buttressed. These are Alangala's fortification walls, which are not so regular and not so nicely buttressed. They also follow the topography of the mountain rather than being neatly geometrical, which is an early Iron Age tradition, which continues here much later than it does elsewhere. Moreover, building techniques are widely disparate across the site, even if you just examine the fortification wall. We looked at 215 meters of the northern fortification wall and basically saw about 7 different types of foundation techniques that were used in what is, after all, the same wall, which gives a sense that perhaps there are several different groups involved in constructing this wall with very little standardization, and really conflicts quite dramatically with that emphasis on standardization in the state assemblage. Furthermore, Alangala's administrative quarter, located at the highest point of the mountain, is unlike Urartian palaces, which in the Caucasus at least tend to be single buildings that combine economic, political, and religious functions. We have at least 2 discrete buildings in the fortified area, which comprises an area of about 1.2 hectares. The main palace to the north is where our excavations have focused, but there's clearly another building south of it as well. The remains are still quite visible on the surface. Another large building, perhaps a temple, constructed of imported basalt blocks, also seems to date to this period, although it has not yet been excavated. The existence of multiple administrative buildings may indicate division of authority between different institutions, unlike the Urartian practice, suggesting perhaps separate spheres of authority within the center. Within these buildings, recovered material also differs from that found in Urartian fortresses. Seals, metalwork, Urartian weaponry, and even pottery are absent or found in small quantities. We initially interpreted bowls made of a distinctive deep red polished fabric as imported Urartian palaceware, but petrographic analysis undertaken by our own Susanna Fishman showed that these vessels were actually made with local clays. Okay, so work so far indicates that elites at Alangala pointedly ignored many aspects of Urartian material culture. But people at Alangala did choose to adopt certain Urartian practices, particularly practices related to ceramic technology and writing. So Susanna's petrographic analysis documents important changes in the organization of production and the economic networks that Alangala participated in. This is a slide that shows the earlier pottery, the early Iron Age pottery, which is all extremely local, all very similar. They're low-fired, tempered wares that fit into general widespread practices of pottery production. In the next period, period 4, the period of the palace, however, there's a major technological shift. Potters used a range of new clays with natural inclusions rather than adding temper, and fired their pots at higher temperatures in different kilns. Such a marked change in technological styles, corresponding to the fortification of the citadel, is probably an indicator of a socio-political shift, perhaps related to increasing regional demand for ceramics and the goods they once held. Moreover, petrographic analysis indicates that a great deal of imported pottery was present at Alangala, indicating again that connections with neighboring regions were probably strengthened during this period, although not necessarily with Urartu, but with the region generally. Susanna's dissertation will focus on explicating the nature of these technological transformations and these economic networks. Cuneiform script was also adopted along the law, but the context of writing here was different than in Urartu. Most larger Urartian fortress sites have inscriptions commemorating military campaigns and imperial constructions. And indeed, we'd expect something like this at Alangala because it's an extremely large site of this period. In Nakhchivan, all of these inscriptions are notably absent. Instead, 6 fragments of cuneiform inscribed vessels have been recovered from excavations within the palace. Most of these belong to large pithoi and record vessel capacity. The shoulders of all the pithoi were also decorated with an incised arrow pattern. You can see it here, which is unattested outside Alangala. The drawing shows the typical Urartian pattern, which you see is sort of fancy molding, but not quite arrow. Hilary Gopnik, the project ceramicist, hypothesizes that this decoration mimics the cuneiform and may emphasize the significance of this important system. Writing here probably works not just to record information, but as a symbol of power, an exotic good. The one other piece of inscribed material found in Nakhchivan might support this interpretation. This is a brick, shown here, inscribed with pseudo-cuneiform. The symbols on the brick mimic these wedges, but are not intelligible. The use of pseudo-writing emphasizes the importance of the representation of writing here as a foreign symbolic system, rather than its actual incorporation into administrative practice. The people who commissioned the monumental architecture at Alangala chose to employ architectural styles that emphasize their continuity with the local past, in opposition to an Urartian ideology that highlighted novelty. In a border region close to traditional Urartian fortresses, this would have been a significant way to mark resistance and establish independence. Ulangala was not alone in this. Other centers on Urartu's border in Armenia and Iran also emphasized continuity with the local past rather than with the Urartian Empire. But the limited presence of cuneiform shows that people at Ulangala did adopt certain imported symbols and technologies. Similarly, graves found nearby include occasional imported items, usually jewelry like this seal, probably worn as an amulet. This might indicate that foreign objects were appropriate for personal display, although the rarity of these items shows that they were not incorporated into daily life. Still, evidence of changes in pottery production and import networks indicates that even if Ulangala remained independent, it participated in larger economic changes in the region, which were probably driven in large part by the desire of Urartu for external goods. So my second case study, Appropriating Empire, focuses not on what Ulangala ignored, what they didn't adopt, but on what imperial symbols they actually chose to adopt. Perhaps a century after the fall of Urartu, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, shown here, conquered the Caucasus and incorporated it into its vast realm. At its height, perhaps as much of a quarter of the world's population at the time lived in this empire. In 331 BC, Alexander the Great defeated the last Persian king and ruled this empire for a little more than 7 years, before his early death left Western Asia in disarray. The late 4th century was a chaotic period during which Alexander's generals fought nearly continuous wars throughout much of the old empire, while other areas, including the Caucasus, asserted their independence. Probably in the late 4th or very early 3rd century BC, a major construction project was begun in Ulangala's northern palace, which was abandoned before it could be finished. Within this construction area, we uncovered a discontinuous ashy surface, occasional hearths, and some late Iron Age pottery. The animal bones that we recovered from this level is small, and these were analyzed by Hannah Lau, who was an undergraduate at Penn, a graduate actually of the anthropology department. But the animal bones come from a very limited set of cuts of sheep and goat, suggesting that we might see some provisioning here. It's quite different from what we find from the later houses. We also have several fragments of typically Achaemenid bowls in the ruins of the palace. Indeed, we initially thought that this was an Achaemenid construction. These artifacts, which were meaningful in an Achaemenid context in which the king's meal symbolized the economic integration of the empire, suggest that local leaders at Ulangala were appropriating and redeploying the symbolism of the now vanished Persian Empire for their own ends. This impression is strengthened by the architecture of the palace. The Period 3 palace occupied the same area and followed the same general alignment as the earlier structure. The largest space and a focal point was the large courtyard you see here. Now, scattered throughout this courtyard, particularly the northeastern part of it, as you can see, were 32 scattered limestone column elements, all of which were in various stages of completion. These include 20 column drums, about 16 of which were more or less complete. You can see, I think, quite clearly that they're all basically unfinished. They still had the lifting bosses on the end, and the exterior surfaces are only roughed out. Now, a worked circle on each of the drums, which you can see here, and then I'm just emphasizing it there, basically shows us what the intended size of each of these drums were. So we were able to reconstruct these as they would have been if they had ever actually been built. Once you measure the diameters, you can see that they sort of go up in pairs, as you would expect for tapering columns. We seem to have 2 of each size, suggesting that we have 2 columns. This works nicely because we also have 2 plinths here, and bits of 2 column bases, which probably were meant to look more like this if they had been completed. Now, this column base is actually an example of what is probably a reworking of an Attic base, a popular Hellenistic type, which we know from Athens, as well as from Seleucid Hellenistic Empire in the east, as at Ai-Khanum in Afghanistan. In addition to these column elements, which seem to draw on a sort of Seleucid sense of ideology, we have two other column bases, shown here. Now, these column bases were smaller than any of our column drums, which created enormous problems for us, because these were very clearly column bases, while the other elements were not so clearly column bases, and we couldn't understand why we couldn't have our column drums fitting on our column bases. We finally realized that they must have had either wooden or perhaps mud brick columns on top of it, and that these were two separate columns. Now, these columns are important because of this little kind of curve here, this bell-shaped base, which is a popular achaemenid form. Indeed, it's a really important form more generally in that it's basically the imperial form, and columned halls are usually a sign of imperial achaemenid architecture. Now, we were able to reconstruct where these columns would have been because we have two areas where there's ashlar masonry preserved, which seem to correspond to doorways leading into our palace. And this, if I can get it to play, is our sort of reconstruction of what that palace would have looked like. Now, it's possible to argue. So, if we wanted to understand these forms at along the law, we can look at how they're used at along the law and what their symbolism might have been outside as well. So bell-shaped columns found here in Achaemenid ideology are often used to represent the actual people of the empire. This is an equation which is made explicit at Darius's tomb at Naqsh-e-Rustam, but you also find it in architecture at Persepolis, as well as this statue found at the site of Susa in Iran, but carved in Egypt. Columned halls were found throughout the empire, including in the Caucasus. Now, in the Achaemenid Empire, such columns were usually deployed in a column hall. They were usually not deployed to mark an entryway. Similarly, in a Hellenistic context, columns are often used to form porticos, which is not quite what we have here. It's possible to argue that whoever began building this palace laid claim to the, at this point, mythic associations of the ruins of the earlier fortress, alluded to the power of the Achaemenid state in the bell-shaped columns, and aligned himself with the emerging power of the Hellenistic world, with the stone columns on attic bases. And this is probably true, but the hybrid column bases from along the law, so clearly on the periphery of the so-called Hellenistic world, may be expressions of more than just a bid for power. The graceful incorporation of the essential hallmarks of authority of two different traditions that were in brutal conflict only a few years before can also be understood as a redefinition of these symbols, perhaps even a playful reinterpretation and domestication of them in this new context, something that was not unknown elsewhere in the Caucasus during this period. And this is jewelry from the site of Vani, Georgia, graves at the site of Vani, Georgia, which again draw on earlier Achaemenid symbolism, but are much later and are deploying these in a very new context. So my final case study considers the occupation of Elangala during the end of the first millennium BC. Here, for the first time, we can see some of the contradictory ways that different people, not just the elite, consumed imperial goods and practices as a way of negotiating between the two dominant empires. So at this point, long after the abandonment of the site's palace, the hill was transformed into a fortified town, located near the frontiers of Media Atropatene and Armenia, in a zone which was pretty much continuously contested by Roman Parthia. Geomagnetic survey revealed evidence of tightly packed houses lying just under the soil across much of this hill that probably date to this period. But there's no sign of a new palace or temple here, indicating a different status for the settlement, whose name may have been Olana, a site which is mentioned, a town which is mentioned by Strabo. The unsettled conditions are probably reflected in where people chose to live. In earlier and later periods, most people lived in the lowlands, close to the river, in dispersed neighborhoods in our city. In this period, in contrast, most of that city was abandoned. Dense walled sites were built on natural hills or prehistoric tells instead, presumably for defense. The material from along the law thus allows us to see how this village of shepherds and farmers negotiated some of the challenges of living on a military frontier. In general, the community during this period looks very different from the earlier first millennium. Portions of 3 houses from this period and 3 burials have been excavated, along with 31 hearths and trash pits found in the ruins of the palace. Analysis of the animal bones found in trash dumps beside the houses indicate that people ate a much less restricted diet than in the previous period, a diet which actually included large amounts of fish and wild birds. And preliminary analysis of plant remains also shows a similar pattern, with large quantities of bread wheat, barley, and millet stored alongside lentils, peas, chickpeas, fruit crops, including walnuts, almonds, and grapes. And this was all analyzed actually in Naomi's lab, because she helped one of the grad students from Johns Hopkins who's working on this project. So the material suggests that agricultural production or consumption were no longer tied into any sort of formal ration or provisioning system, as they may have been when this was an administrative order. Evidence from the area of the northern palace illustrates how people incorporated what would have been the still monumental ruins of the palace into daily life. So we have evidence of these very large pits, which are filled with, they have high densities of animal bones within them, as well as basically broken serving wares and cooking wares, and which we interpret as possibly pits for feasting, given this sort of elaborate setting, as well as the fact that these pits look quite different from the domestic trash pits that we have associated with the houses. So we suggest that these imposing ruins may become part of a local narrative, one that could have made sense of life in this particular village. However, despite that, we do see ways that people at the site are integrating material, imported material from Parthia and Rome into their daily lives differently. So we were able to excavate in 2008 a very small corner of what is probably quite a large house, a sort of villa. It's the only place on the site that we find this pottery in excavated context. This is a basically Parthian ware, triangle ware, which seems to have been used perhaps only by this group. At least we don't find it in these houses, which are much simpler 2-roomed houses, perhaps belonging to pastoralists. Other material on the site, however, is more commonly used. So once again, Susanna Fishman's petrographic analysis, I'm pulling all of this from Susanna's work, shows that this really ubiquitous form was probably produced at the site of Artashat, the capital of Armenia, during this time period. And in fact, in a sort of Eastern Roman context, it might be understood as playing on Eastern sigillata ware, an example of Eastern sigillata ware, which I've shown an example from Troy, actually, on the upper left-hand corner. I have to, right? I think this becomes popular and is integrated across the site, not because of the necessarily strength of Roman Armenia, but because the look, the wear of this really echoes the red wares which are predominant during the earlier 2 periods as well. So this is a local tradition where imported material are adopted precisely because they fit into these long-lived traditions. We see something similar from the burials, the different ways that imported material are used. So we have 3 burials. 2 of them are quite simple, and the analysis of this was done by Anna Weeks for her MA thesis here in the anthropology department. And then we have one more elaborate burial. This is a Pithos burial, which again draws upon symbolism from both within along the law and far outside. The Pithos itself is actually probably made locally. It resembles a Parthian form, and the practice of putting this kind of pot next to it, the pot again looks very Parthian, although I suspect it was made locally, though we haven't actually analyzed it, I don't think.
No,
so
not yet.
I shouldn't really say that. Within this burial, however, we had a huge amount of grave goods, almost all of which were coming not from Parthia, but from the Roman Empire. So we had 4 Augustan coins, 2 glass bottles, 5 Roman-style rings, and an eye bead with Egyptian and Phoenician parallels. Oxygen isotope analysis on the teeth of this individual suggests that he also may not be local. He was probably born not within at least this valley. He could either have been a merchant or perhaps a soldier, settled in this frontier district after discharge. The people who buried him clearly drew upon goods and symbols taken from a range of traditions, providing an example of how individuals continue to participate in a broader cultural sphere, even in a small town, that seemed to generally emphasize its local past, if our interpretation of feasting in the ruins of the palace is accurate. Okay, so to sum up, each of these case studies provides different insight into how people in the Caucasus negotiated imperial demands and carved out spaces for themselves and their concerns within the wider empire. In none of these cases do we see clear evidence of unproblematic acculturation. At no point did Elangala represent a typically Urartian, Hellenistic, or Roman town, despite early attempts to make it so, based on, for example, the initial Soviet survey of the site conducted in the 1930s. In the early 8th century, for example, the continued local nature of the material indicates a particular relationship to Urartu, one in which this empire's yen for standardization was successfully resisted, while the local elite appropriated certain luxury goods and administrative systems, like writing, perhaps incorporating them into a new context. At the same time, the city was affected by the larger economic changes brought about at least partially by the rise of two empires, Urartu and Assyria. In the late 4th century, on the other hand, a new local ruler manipulated the symbolism of the Achaemenid Persia and Hellenistic world, constructing his own authority. Finally, in the last century BC, many of the townspeople of Elangala seem to have maintained their distance from the competing empires of Rome and Parthia in most economic practices and daily ritual. But certain individuals had close connections to the empires and their goods. Now, I'd like to return, as a sort of coda, to some of the implications of post-colonialism in this particular place for decolonizing our own archaeological practice and interpretation. When Veli Bakshaliev, Safar Ashraf, and I set up the Nakhchivan Archaeological Project, we were keen to avoid the colonial systems of archaeology often in place in the Middle East. It was important to all of us that the team functioned as one unit, that all of the Americans and Azerbaijanis used the same excavation techniques, made decisions together, and were all similarly valued. Individuals took notes in their native language, and all material was translated into the 3 project languages of English, Russian, and Azerbaijani for our own use and for publications. Both American and Azerbaijani students had access to material, and indeed there's now 1 Azerbaijani and 2 American PhDs in progress, and 1 American and 2 Azerbaijani MAs that had been completed. Since Ashraf grew up in a nearby village and Bakshaliev had long worked in the area, we used their local connections to incorporate the project into the larger community. Moreover, we developed our own site-based chronology, which we used in all publications in order to get away from weighted political terms like Hellenistic or Roman. And yet, in post-Soviet Nakhchivan, a territory separated from the rest of Azerbaijan by Armenia, we were soon forced to confront the challenges of post-colonialism in the Caucasus, namely the continuation of a political discourse that uses history and archaeology to underwrite narratives of ethnogenesis and ethnic exclusion. In summer 2010, we were hauled up before the National Academy of Sciences to explain an article that had appeared in Russian in an Armenian nationalist newspaper. The article described our excavations and claimed that it provided evidence that Nakhchivan was, and has always been, historically Armenian, and called for the return of this territory. This was actually the first time in my life that I ever gave a press conference in Azerbaijani, although strangely not the last. Now, it was really clear once we found this article that the information had come from our own website, the Russian language version of our website, and was simply based on the fact that we noted that we had Urartian palaceware at Elangala. So in order to continue excavations here, I had to tell basically the National Academy that I had not actually provided this information to the nationalist Armenian publication, nor, importantly, was the interpretation of the archaeology of the region correct. Urartu, I tried to assure the Academy, was not the same thing as Armenia. It was an empire, a multi-ethnic state, with a language unrelated to Armenia that, yes, partially included Armenia in its territory. Nonetheless, when the Azeri press reported on the event, our own excavations, unsurprisingly, were treated as evidence of the prevailing Azerbaijani character of Nakhchivan, and proof that it had never belonged to Armenia. This incident brought home to me a lesson learned by many archaeologists in the Caucasus, which is simply that within the current post-colonial situation, work on ancient empires is far from esoteric. Rather, it matters deeply to many stakeholders, some of whom might use our data in ways that we might find disturbing. So I will end there.
So if anybody has any questions now for Ristvet. I want to open up the floor.
I'll start off since no one else is asking. I really very much enjoyed your talk. And one thing I was wanting to get clarified a little bit more was the language of desire you used at the beginning. And then it kind of seemed to a bit fade out. And I'm wondering, how does desire figure into your thinking about these issues? You also had the semiotics in there at the beginning, which kind of faded out later as well. So I was wondering if you could talk maybe about those two things, or especially about the desire part.
Sure, sure. You know, because the topic was desire, I felt that I had to address ideas of desire within this paper. And obviously there's a very productive literature on desire in colonial situations, which I have spent much of the last week or two reading to see how I could get some kind of handle on this for my own work. And I sort of would like to pursue this further in terms, I hope, of the same types of thing of integrating how people integrate different material, what they choose to do, what they choose not to do. But I wasn't able to entirely get a handle on everything that I wanted to do with this now. The way people have usually used desire in archaeology, especially in terms of the archaeology of empires, has to do very much with sexual desire and with a kind of gender politics. And I don't really have material from my work in Along the Law that allows me to query this. So this is precisely how Barbara Voss, for example, has looked at this in her work in colonial San Francisco. So I was hoping to get at desire by looking at it more in terms of sort of incorporation, thinking in terms of the lack, thinking in terms of how people might fill that, thinking in economic terms. But it's true, it's not entirely thought out. Similarly, I'd like to return at some point to the semiotics and think of the ways that these objects mean, because I actually think that does underline a lot of what I'm talking about, even if I didn't really return to it as much. Because otherwise, I don't think you can really get at anything that's going on with these objects or these various societies if you don't see how these materials are working with other materials.
One thing that springs to mind is that desire and reality are frequently in conflict. So our meetings with desire, the power, you know, it's like it's about power, and just because you want it doesn't mean you have it.
Sure. Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of desire here on a lot of different levels. I like that.
One thing that struck me was that there seemed to be two different loci from which imagery that might seem relevant to the theme desire emanates. Mm-hmm. One is the institutional structures, the pillars, the columns, the buildings, which of course require an enormous resource base even to construct. And so therefore our official archaeological documents in stone, as it were, mm-hmm. Which differentiate the placement of the empire from all other empires, right? And so they seem to have a particular tack on what to appropriate and not to appropriate for a political purpose. On the other hand, you have the everyday folks who are borrowing willy-nilly, presumably, I don't know, but presumably because certain artifacts were more available or better, accessible or something like that. So there seems to be many different trajectories of how, at least two, which could be separated out, perhaps, to think of what people are drawn to and what statements or messages are conveyed by the things that they deploy and recycle within their own lives and institutions.
Sure. Yeah. No. Excellent. I think one of the things that makes this case study different than a lot of archaeological approaches to empire, at least in this area more recently, is that a lot of those have really focused on how weak the empires are and situations of colonialism. So people in my my grad seminar, have been looking a lot at basically the relationship between Massalia, which was a Greek colony, and normal sort of Mediterranean sites in France that were not Greek colonies. And in that work done by Michael Dietler, there's an emphasis on sort of how little power asymmetry there is, and maybe how little actual economic and political change there is. Well, here, frankly, we can tell, I mean, even just from the pottery, the idea that people are completely transforming these technologies of production and suddenly are incorporated into this widespread economic exchange, which is just not just the exchange of specific valued commodities, but seems like a very widespread change in everyday life, sort of shows that no, they're dealing with big political and economic changes here, but in some ways are choosing not to adopt as much those like elite symbols. So yeah, that's a very good way to think of that.
Thanks. I wondered, and following from Asa's point, I wonder to what extent it might be useful to think about the methodological limits here. Because in some ways, and maybe one of the points to buttress this taxonomy that Asa is suggesting is that we might think about intention and to what extent pragmatic use, as it maps onto material culture, operates within a particular horizon, and there are limits to the ways in which we might understand their utilization. On the other hand, I think this is part of the other taxonomy, the psychic life, the aspirational intention, sort of the kind of leaps that you're making by way of thinking about empire and desire. I wonder to what extent, when we start to think about intention and the psychic life of things, to what extent the problem of material culture going back so far really allows us to make statements about desire to the extent that we might be so propelled. Because if we compare the way that you ended your talk, which I thought was equally provocative, the idea that there's a desire to remap Armenian history, there's a desire to remap nationalist endeavors, as well as particular kind of desires to be relevant, right, to claims using the work of science. It's clear that there's our ability to map intention is quite clear there. Nationalist intention, etc. There are all sorts of ways that we might think about the use of material culture and scientific data to that end. But if we return to some of the earlier data that you suggested, I see limits to the extent to which the psychic life of desire becomes part of the calculus. And so I wonder if intention is useful here for thinking about these various taxonomies and how we might map on desire onto some of the data.
Okay. I mean, I think one of the problems with not thinking in those terms is that there's a tendency in archaeology often to forget that there are people behind what we're dealing with, that there are people in the past who are in fact making decisions. I mean, granted, we can't get at much of that intentionality especially, But I think it's useful for us to sort of problematize it sometimes, and not just think in terms of the taxonomies that we often do of, okay, well, this shows this, and this shows this, and sort of categorize it, and actually consider why this might be part of a particular strategy. You recognize that these are actual sort of choices that people make, even if we can't necessarily tell how they're making those choices, or get at their intentionality the way that we can the sort of intentionality behind either the press conference I participated in, or the author of the article. But I think it's still a useful activity, at least, to try to consider how this might have worked, and how it might have worked in ways that are complex, although acknowledging that these complexities prevent us from entirely ever getting at much of this situation. Okay, Anne first.
Yeah, and to admit something, and keep teaching Lauren in that seminar, something that strikes me about your site, and what is probably unfortunately some of the scholarly picture with other people, is I think it's destined for a while, except when you fight back, it's going to become a kind of footnote in political studies and whatever, saying there are traces of X, by the way. When what you've got is a site that I would find valuable as case study for several reasons. One, I think it's enormously productive to focus on what people don't do, which is very deeper. And you can at least see a moment of rejecting the available at even a basic level. The other is the continuing heterodoxy at any one phase of what you get in the site. So that these are people who, on the one hand, you own artifacts to make a statement. At least we all want to believe this, and if we don't, we have to stop it. What we do. Whatever it is that allows you to show status and caste is not so much about a very rigid taxonomy, but about, in some ways, the very existence of variety. And that gets into the issue that you get even in monumental cultures elsewhere. Theory and method themselves even dealt badly with what's called a classicism. With a kind of synthesis of positioning yourself as a town that has access to anything that it wants. And this is what stood out for me, was a very good use of the negative fact, and a lot of heterodoxy at any one phase. I mean, these people know they have not built a style law, and they know they have not built a huge political building, which helps prove that they're very conscious of what they do bring into it. Where they bring it in nowhere else in the site.
Yeah, I mean, I think...
So the view from someone who does Hellenistic polyethnic, like me, is this is what your site is very interesting for. And I think you can work the desire not to, as well as the desire to do, into this in some productive ways, like the seeming desire to keep incorporating pastness into artifacting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's very useful. Yeah, I mean, I think I was obviously, when writing this, talking against what, especially for the later material, partly because of the kind of discourse which you find in a lot of classical archaeology would see this, not your work obviously,
No, I'm with you.
but would sort of see this as being a place where, if they don't choose, if their column base isn't a proper bell-shaped column base, but also adds in some sort of Hellenistic element, it's just because they're not smart enough to understand why the Greeks are superior and what the actual Greek form of this should be. And so, I mean, I think what I was sort of trying to fight against was saying, no, this is not a useful way to consider this, given the area that we're talking about, given its history. They know what these symbols are, and they're choosing to do something with them or not do something. I mean, they're not approaching this necessarily from a position of, ignorance. I mean, they're sort of making active choices or not choices. I mean, I think even though it might not seem this way for the Urartian example, those Urartian sites are so incredibly uniform across this territory, which is so incredibly geographically divided because of the mountains and the valleys, and has always been so linguistically and ethnically diverse during any of the historical periods that we know, that again, choosing not to build that way at the same time, when we know it's the same time because we know they are taking certain things, is important. And it probably actually was a really forceful statement. So, Richard?
Just add very quickly, I think not only is this intentionality in terms of the present, as you talk about both present day, but at the present time in terms of what you're looking at the past, but also you did talk about memory, and you talked about going back to this ruined palace and putting pits in and connecting that present to the past. And that part of that connection is about looking to the past, looking perhaps at that monumentality, looking at that palace, looking at perhaps the power associated with that, and maybe then looking at the desire to replicate that, or at least to hark back to it in order to reflect it. And so I think there is something about both the intentionality that you see that is very clearly associated with something of the past and something that connects themselves to the past and acting with.
Yeah, no, exactly. When I was writing this, I realized again and again how important the past, and especially this very local past, was to people here. I mean, they're sort of also playing with the maybe not always local past and using some of the accumulate symbolism, but I mean, just the way they keep reusing these ruins again and again is sort of interesting. So, Tad, first?
My question, in some ways, is related to this with regard to attention, but to what extent is the fact that the site is architecturally dissimilar a matter not so much a choice of the inhabitants, but the tolerance of the Urartians or other empires to allow it to exist in its own way because of the fact it serves some specific purpose, like a trade center or it's a production center, or it has some value in and of itself, and therefore perhaps does not merit the energy to destroy it and remake it in some sort of form. And does the site actually represent a whole series of peripheries here, which are these buffer zones, which because of this transient power, it's more useful to basically use them as they are, as opposed to trying to begin to remake them in some fashion along the sort of Urartian and state monumental style.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. It's very hard for us to know if this site was ever, say, officially incorporated into the Urartian Empire or not, given the nature of the material that we have. I mean, I think when I started excavation at the site, I was like, oh, well, clearly we'll probably just find an Urartian. I just assumed it was an Urartian site, given its location and given what it kind of looked like, its monumentality, really. So I really expected to find an Urartian inscription early on, because, I mean, again, there's a site just across the river that has Urartian inscriptions. There are a lot of Urartian inscriptions in northwestern Iran, which not very far from this place. So when we didn't find that, it then became a problem with understanding this place, as well as actually in some ways understanding Urartu, which I think has really been overdrawn to a large extent in seeing it in this state assemblage, and that you definitely have that, but along the law is not alone. There are other places on its borders as well that are sort of doing similar things. Some of them are actually definitely incorporated into the Urartian Empire. So there's a site near Armenia's Lake Sivan, near the sort of northern frontiers of this empire, which looks a lot like Alangala in that it again emphasizes this past ways of building, these sort of very local early Iron Age architectural strategies. But there's actually one of these big inscriptions on this very local looking wall saying that it was conquered and then turned into an Urartian city and given a new name to honor, in fact, an Urartian god. Right? So we sort of see something like that, which could, of course, have happened at Alangala as well. We have other places that are more likely entirely outside of the empire. So some of the sites that are in northwestern Iran, closer to the Caspian, which still have certain objects, and often similar kinds of objects, often these sort of elite objects which could be given as gifts in elite exchange, but, you know, look quite different otherwise from sort of Urartian states.
So, thank you so much, and the question sort of connects to Tad's. So I was struck by that wall that you discussed that had different building techniques, and somehow we linked it to eclecticism and sort of the celebration of different communities there. But if you build a wall, you would prefer standardization over non-standardization in order for it to stand. So I'm wondering to what extent people negotiated those different techniques, and what were sort of the, I guess, the temporal horizons of, you know, building these walls. And as archaeologists, can one see how they fell apart? I don't know. So that, you know, there's some limit to non-standardization in a technical sense, but also in the sense of the durability of this environment.
That's a great question. I did not bring this out in the talk at all, and it does follow on very nicely to what I was saying to Tad. But if this area is not part of Urartu, I suspect that the palace at Ulaanbaatar is nonetheless sort of a response to Urartian aggression in the region. And in that case, I suspect that it might be the center of a coalition. We know from the textual record that the Urartians were often fighting these sort of disparate tribes, which we first see as many, many, many different names, and then tend to be united under one sort of title. So within this group, there's a group called the Etiuni, who, you know, seem to come together and fight Urartu. So first they're fighting lots and lots of people, and then it's just sort of like the Etiuni as one group. So what happens more generally in this area is that actually there is a reconfiguration of settlement patterns to focus more on this part of Nakhchivan, perhaps more on this frontier region, and sites elsewhere are abandoned. So we do see a sort of larger centralization of settlement. And so I sort of thought that perhaps if we do have disparate sources of authority, perhaps shown by the several different administrative buildings that we have at this site, unlike the unified single Urartian palaces, that maybe this is kind of what we have. Many different people coming together, agreeing to come together, building stuff, but never really having one person who is completely in charge and can say, this is how we build the wall. You know, we shave down the stone like this, then we have 3 layers of mud brick, then we put these stones. I mean, the wall, it didn't fall apart, right? It's still standing today, so it's lasted for 3,000 years. So they didn't do a bad job, even if it looks haphazard when we look at it. And much of what we're seeing as haphazard isn't always what would have not always been visible on the surface. A lot of it is what's being done with the foundations. So sort of, you know, from the bedrock to the first bits of stones that would have actually stood and been there. But they seem to at least have tolerated a high degree of kind of anything goes in this sense, at least. Any other questions? Okay, great. Thank you very much.